Let me start by asking, you both talked about breaking down barriers. So I'm just going to get right to it. Is public art, the way that you are curating it, the way that you're talking about it, is it answering some tensions about museums?
I think that one reason why I continue to work in museums is that I find that they're all so radically different and they're all very, very specific. And so working at the Peabody Essex Museum with its very particular history of these kinds of cross-cultural connections and being founded in a way at the origins of American global entrepreneurship gives me a kind of an access point or a context to discuss and frame issues and ideas and practices that I think are much more broadly relevant in our culture today. But, you know, at the same time, a lot of I would say that Pedro and I are of a generation that kind of emerged out of, I mean, this is going to sound too dramatic, but you know, a kind of a collapse in an old paradigm of the idea that the museum was totally removed from life, and we began making projects in museums, but in other places too, and it's. I think there's very definitely a generational thing that we share in that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think for me, one of the things that, you know, in talking to artists, I often feel very guided by artists. And when artists are saying, well, I'd like to do this, but I can't, you know, when artists say, you know, I talked to my gallery about the next project I want to do, and they said, well, we really can't help you. We'll talk to a museum. The museum can't help. And I've heard this repeatedly, and you know, and I think that there is now room, or in many ways, we're creating the kind of a third space, right? Something that doesn't have. I mean, museums have you know, scholarly pursuits. Galleries have commercial pursuits. But I think sometimes the artists are interested in reaching audiences that don't attend museums, that they feel limited by just the art world. And providing, this is a way to provide them with that opportunity.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, we get interested in artists because they have such particular perspectives on the world. And then when they move to work in a museum or a commercial gallery, they're so often forced into other kinds of boxes. And when I think about, you know, the word museum being, its origins being in the idea of the muse, or these kind of personifications of inspirations, and so like I'm always asking myself, like, how can I bring the muse back to the museum?
I'm interested that you just talked about being forced into boxes. So what are we seeing in public art then? Is it different? Is it a more pure form of expression?
I just think it's different. I mean, I don't want to sound like I have anything against museums. I love doing shows in museums, and there's certain artists that I would never do public art with. They just, you know. But the idea is that you know, it's a really big world with a lot of people, and I think that, you know, the tradition of the curator as a gatekeeper, right? You know, is dissolving in many ways. Where the internet has made it difficult for all of us, right? Burning Man, right? To think about people who are making large-scale works that would otherwise be considered art, specifically for Burning Man, says a lot about how, you know, we don't control exactly what's going on anymore.
Absolutely. And something like Burning Man then makes possible, like, because of the very specific conditions, you have work that's being developed that responds to that engages with those specific qualities the same way as you're talking about engaging with the specific qualities of these sites, what they bring out in you intellectually, emotionally, as a citizen.
I was just going to ask on that point, what is it like to see the engagement that you've both seen with the public works that you've done, to see that conversation about the Hancock Tower, to see those people engaging with the Strand Beast? I mean, I still remember the goosebumps I had just engaging that I didn't expect. I mean, how does it change what you do going forward?
I don't know that it changes me so much as it just redoubles that sense that you have to pay attention to those moments. You know, like when I first saw the Strand Beast, I just saw it on YouTube, and somebody said, "Oh, you should do a show with the Strand Beast." I'm going, "Yeah, I've heard this one before." But then, like, I went, and I had that feeling, and the whole process emerged from having that instinctive feeling that you then start to unpack and explore. And the more projects that I can do that can inspire that reaction in others, the happier I am.
Yeah, I'll confess that the first time I encountered street art, I said, "Oh, that's kind of cool, but it's not art." That was my initial reaction. And then I kept encountering and thinking about it, and I thought, well, why isn't it art, right? In a moment where anything can be art, literally anything. And this was at the height of Maurizio Catalan's career. Well, not the height, but you know, Maurizio was making homeless people and putting them in front of museums. And I thought, wow, why is that art and not this? So I had to go meet them and talk to them, and I realized, no, this is art. It's just that they're not functioning within a specific circuit. And and then watching the response to this group of artists, learning from them how to communicate with the public, how to engage the public, made me think very differently about it. And I have to say that one of the most gratifying moments I've had in my career was the Jonathan Monk sculpture, the pyramid, when the kids were dancing on top of it and people were skating on it. And that was, it had just opened. And seeing how the community just jumped on it. Most people will never know that that was Jonathan Monk. Not that Jonathan really cares, honestly, but the fact is that that experience, though, will change a lot of people's lives. When I called the manager of the skate park to get some feedback from him, I said, "Hey, you know, how did it go? How was it received?" Mm-hmm. He said, "Oh, yeah, no, people really loved it." And I said, "Well, did they tell you that?" He said, No, these are skaters. They didn't burn it down or take a sledgehammer to it. So it means that they liked it." And I thought, great.
But I really like the way that you described your coming to street art, because so often people imagine that, you know, if you don't get it right away, that somehow it's false or that you're doing something wrong. But so often, like, I will see a work of art and I'll just be dumb to it. I'll be completely dumb to it. And then I see it again, or another work by that artist a couple years later, or in a different context, or somebody says something. And all of a sudden, your perspective on the work and its place in the world changes. And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about what you guys are doing here, that, you know, these are sites that people have seen over and over again. In other cases, it'll be something that draws me out there for the first time. But the idea that there's a kind of a longer process, that it's okay, that it's a kind of a journey.
No, you're right, and those peculiarities, right, those attributes of each of the sites were taken into account. So Jeppe's piece will be up for over a year, precisely because of the seasons, right? I'm hoping people will go see it, and watch it change in the snow, when the foliage is in the fall, and in the summer.
How much are you dealing with what I think, from my coverage I see, is an ongoing intimidation by art, where people feel that they're supposed to understand that pyramid in a certain way, or they need those labels, or they need the curators to tell them what they're seeing?
I hate explaining things. It's the worst part of my job. I'm much more interested in trying to set the conditions to inspire people. But I think it's fair to say that we all have different ways of processing new experiences and new information, and some people want to get there by a kind of a recitation of facts so that they can understand it in terms of a structure and hierarchy of experiences, and other people don't want to know anything, and just feel it and go from that gut instinct. I mean, how do you find that challenge as a journalist? I mean, this is a fundamental question for you, because you talk to people all the time about the kinds of things that we do.
Well, I'm off the hook because I just report. So I mean, honestly, I'm extending your words essentially.
Yeah, I've noticed, I'm sure this happens to all our colleagues, are often that people will come to me and say, well, I saw this piece at the museum, but I'm not an expert. I really don't know anything about art, and it's funny because people don't say that after they saw a movie, right? Even or read a book or listened to music. In most cases, people just say, oh, that movie was terrible, or I loved it. And with art, it's more complicated. And I'm convinced that the public wants more art. I'm convinced that the public wants to engage with art. What they don't want is to feel stupid or intimidated. That's more our job. I mean, to figure out how to make it so that people are comfortable with art. Right? Is
that a problem? Do you think that is a situation where people are being made to feel stupid?
Well, it's not intentional.
Not intentional.
No.
I don't mean to say that intentionally, but you know what I'm saying, that there's that impression.
Well, certainly in the museum world, there's more and more not only resources, but real work that's done in trying to think about how best to get rid of that kind of attitude. Like, what are the tools that people need? How simply can you say it? It's like when you go to a museum and you see a label on the wall, the first sentence you do not want to read is, with minimal art in 19 whatever. No, it's like you're in the present tense. You're with this thing. So let's talk about this thing now.
And I don't want to speak for you, but I'm assuming, it's not that I don't have a problem with scholarship. I don't have a problem with art, that's complicated, with art that's, tough to decipher. I mean, it can be a lot of fun. It can be very interesting. But what I find is that, one of sort of the first rules when we're putting up a show is, don't dumb it down. Don't dumb it down. I always hear that. People are always saying, oh, well, I don't want to dumb it down. And I thought, well, God damn, how do you present something that people can relate to without dumbing it down, right? And without pandering, without making it easy and fluffy, and that was one of the reasons why I thought about, watching my kids who wanted to climb on a sculpture. I thought, well, why not? Like, why not? And we all have these experiences. So I thought, if we can participate, if we can engage more directly, like with skaters, if we with inmates, I mean, even if we can put work out in public and create a different dialogue, well, that's I think a step in a direction that isn't often taken. I don't think any of this is particularly new. It's just something that isn't done as often as maybe it could be.
Yeah, and as I think you said in your talk, when people come to a museum to see something, they're coming with a whole bunch of cultural baggage that says this is how I am supposed to receive this. Whereas if you come across a work in a park or on a wall by South Station, it's up for grabs. You can make up your own story. It really doesn't have the kind of heaviness of the institutional voice, or what you've in a way been brought up to believe is the institutional voice.
How much is the landscape shifting right now? I mean, I talked about that in my opening remarks. I feel like there's a shift. I feel like there's a greater openness, especially to public art in this region. But do you both feel that, or am I just being a Pollyanna?
Oh, I definitely feel it.
And what's happening right now? Why is it changing?
I don't know why, but it was about time, and and I think we've become maybe a little more daring. There've been people who've shown some leadership and went out there and just did stuff, and luckily some of it was successful, and that allowed more to happen. I think it's been incremental, but what I also like is that there's a diversity. It's not all huge projects, right? Some of it are small community-based projects and with different intentions, and I think that we're watching an ecosystem develop. I think that's very exciting.
I definitely think that we are seeing an ecosystem develop. The other thing that we're seeing is, the way that we receive and share information has been dramatically transformed in the last 10 or 15 years with, like, you remember when like the cell phones used to be like a brick about this big, and we thought, this is never going to catch on. And now, like I'll probably be sitting in the Uber going home, and I'll be looking up something that you said, and so the barrier to entry is becoming lower and lower and lower. So more people can actually kind of participate in the discussion. And I also think that, art has its specialized discourses, but more and more, like, you go on the web and people don't really care whether it's art or design or music. It's like, does it turn me on? Does it interest me? Does it connect to something in my life? And they're making their own kind of imaginative maps that aren't being pre-drawn by people like me.
And I think that you're right. I mean, this idea of agency, right? People feel more agency. The public just does stuff, and hire someone to put up a mural on their garage. I think that these possibilities, because we're more interconnected, because these barriers have been lowered, allow for a proliferation of all different forms of expression. Now, I have to say I don't love everything I see. Most of the time, I'm not that interested. But what has happened, though, is that I have become much more critical of my predisposition to reject things. And I really think about it now, and may ask someone a lot younger than me, what do you think about this? Or ask my kids, or, my wife. So.
What about being able to see, this notion of the world is flat, and being able to, in a moment's notice, see what's happening around the world, and knowing that your audience is also seeing that, so their expectations presumably are higher too, because they know what's happening in all the great art capitals around the world, and all the great little nooks too. By the way, I didn't mean to suggest earlier that there's no public art in the city, because there have been great organizations doing it, but there's more conversation, I think, now. But back to that point about, you're being able to see everything at once, how does that change what you do?
Well, I think it changes the nature of the kinds of communities of interest that we can form. 25 years ago, you know, when I was making shows in my garage, I was inspired by what was going on in places like Glasgow and in Copenhagen and some of these other centers that had a real DIY aesthetic. But, you know, I was just reading about it. I wasn't really in touch with them. I wasn't dialoguing with them. Today, you can kind of do that in real time. I mean, I'm not convinced that the world is flattened out that much. I think probably, I mean, it's hard to kind of talk about these, you know, the fabulous access that we have without kind of acknowledging that, you know, we live in a country where there is huge disparities of access to education, to public infrastructure, and that's a really, really big issue. But I would say overall that difference is being configured differently.
No, you know, you know, one of the challenges that I find, you know, when we met in France, you know, I don't know, that was a while ago. And when we met in France 20 years ago maybe, there was, the frame of reference was much clearer. We all shared a similar frame of reference. And we would journey to similar exhibitions and locations, and the dialogue was similar, and we would learn, but the frame of reference was very similar. And now with this plurality, that frame of reference has changed. And before, if someone, you know, a colleague would mention an artist, you would be like, oh my God, I don't know who that is, and then you'd like look into it. Now someone mentions an artist, and you're like, okay, you might ask more questions, because, I mean, you can't know all the artists today. Not that you did before, but it felt like you did. So there's definitely more access, and what we do or have done provides more access, because that's why they hire us, right? Because we can do these shows.
In theory.
What about being bold and daring? You've had controversy for your Greenway mural. How far can you push, and is it your job to push?
Yeah. I think part of our job is to show initiative, leadership, you know, guide the public. You know, I don't expect to always be right, but I do start with the idea, with knowing that I'm not going to please everyone, and I'm not trying to. Now, I've been very lucky. But, you know, Ojemios. I mean, it was, someone thought, people thought it was a terrorist. That was largely perpetuated by Fox News, by the way. But the whole idea is that, yeah, some people are not going to like it. They're going to take issue with something. And that's okay. To get back to the Tony Metelli, the thing that really weirded me out about the Tony Metelli was the intolerance towards it. I mean, that's one of the advantages.
That was way more frightening.
Yeah.
Than a kind of a strange somnambulic guy in his tidy whities.
Hey, what about you, Trevor? How do you feel about?
Well, I think as a curator, I'm drawn to work in this very kind of contextual way, which means that I'm not necessarily like, I'm never seeking controversy. I'm seeking to present a project that can open a conversation, that can kind of connect across cultures or across times, or, I mean, I'm doing a lot of that kind of work right now because of the nature of the Peabody Essex Museum. But when you get a certain way into the project, you start making decisions based on, well, what does this need to be a satisfying experience, to be a successful work? I mean, I imagine it's not that different from a poet who goes down and, like, you're testing the sound and the shape of words, and it doesn't matter. I mean, there's that process, and the process leads you to something, and you're just trying to follow the process. And when it results in something, it has found its place in the world, and if I've done my job well, I hope that it does cause questions or helps somebody think of their place in the world a little differently.
And finally, I just want to ask, before I turn it over to your questions so you can start thinking about them, as of right now, there isn't necessarily a master plan in this region for public art, or we're about to hear what the results of the Boston Creates plan, what those survey results are. Should there be a more cohesive effort, or should it continue on the more organic path that it has been?
I think it's good for the city to show the leadership that it's now doing with the plan. A plan in and of itself is not going to do much if there's not people like yourselves who are committed and passionate and supporting and making and doing and writing. But on its own, I think it's a great initiative.
Yeah, I've had, I wouldn't have been able to do many of these public works without the support of City Hall, and the city has been great. So I'm glad that they have more of an initiative and that they're developing a plan, and we'll see how we can make it even better. But it is a collaborative effort. I mean, it's not just City Hall, it's not just the trustees, it's not just PEM, it's all of us working together. I mean, that's what will really make a difference.
It's all of us people,
yeah,
as citizens.
Yeah.
Well, let me now open it up to questions. I don't know if we have mics that, yeah, we do have mics that will be brought out, so we're happy to take some of your questions now. Or there's always this awkward moment where I've asked all the questions, but right back in the middle.
Okay, so I really appreciate how a lot of the work that you showed aims to create cross-cultural connections. But it's really ironic that in this conversation about public art and in the participants in the room, in the audience, there's an overwhelming lack of diversity. And so I'm curious, thank you. I'm curious to hear what you think needs to happen to change the dynamic lack of representation of people of color as makers and participants in these types of conversations.
Well, you're absolutely right. This room is fairly homogeneous. It's one of many homogeneous rooms that I find myself in. It's sort of, but I would also say that if I think about the kinds of rooms that I would sit in when I started my career 20, 30 years ago, the room is a lot more diverse, where I know as somebody who, say, studied art history, I mean, I studied European art history. Didn't know anything about what was going on in Asia or Africa. We're barely kind of, I would say the field had barely begun to even digest the concept of feminism, for God's sakes. So it's a long road. I think the progress is much too slow. I don't have a specific prescription for it. I mean, certainly the older I get, the more aware I am of my own particular framing of things. And like Pedro said, you know, really questioning that. You know, I work for a museum that sort of has a global range of cultures, but we have a real cultural representation problem too. And I think I'm drawn to work there in part because the institution's DNA is so bound up in thinking about what happens or what can happen, both the good and the bad, where cultures meet. And I feel like I'm just kind of at the start of that journey, but that's my own story.
Well, no, I mean, I started my career in Mexico. I mean, people are often surprised. I am Mexican. I'm the guy Trump wants to get rid of. So when I was in Mexico as a student, you know, Mexico was basically limited to the muralists. That was it. There was a guy named Gabriel Orozco who was doing some stuff and, you know, who made it big abroad. And in Mexico, we were very suspicious of him because he wasn't sort of doing what Mexicans did, which was figurative narrative painting. And also in coming to the United States, there was a total ignorance about what was going on in Mexico. And then Mexico got smoking hot for many reasons, largely Gabriel Orozco. The Jumex collection, Curimanzuto, there were many factors. That ecosystem developed, it thrived, and then Mexico was hot. There was that big show at PS1, there was several shows here, the ICA did a couple, and that changed, the dialogue changed. So it is changing, it has changed, and I've seen a dramatic shift from when I would say, you know, to a curator from the United States that I was from Mexico, and they would look at me like I was an insect. So it's definitely changed. Now, has it changed enough? No, I don't think so. But we're trying, right? I mean, for me, you know, working with inmates was, you know, just to address the problem of mass incarceration, to work with inmates and people in the reentry program. I mean, that's diversity. I mean, and we, you know, that and doing something in downtown Philadelphia. Who's been to downtown Philadelphia? That is a very different. That is not Back Bay, and looking at putting a work of art in that context to address mass incarceration was totally intentional, and we were very lucky to be able to put it right next to City Hall. So there, you know, we're doing our best.
Thanks. Yeah, Pedro, you mentioned Philadelphia. Could you talk about the differences in working in Philadelphia as a curator, or for that matter, as an artist, versus working in Boston as a curator or as an artist? I mean, I'm assuming there are different dynamics, and if so, what are they? And are there any lessons that one can learn from the other?
Well, you've got the Quakers and you've got the Puritans. You also have a city that has gone through, Philadelphia's gone through a terrible economic downturn, depopulation, you know, tons of empty space, cheap real estate. You can buy a building for nothing. Sound familiar? No, it doesn't, because Boston's going through the opposite problem, right? The biggest problem we have here is cost of living. And very different problem to Philadelphia. So it was, I think that you know, scarcity of resources forced Philadelphia to come together, organizations to work together to address very specific problems that the city was facing, and they couldn't solve problems the old-fashioned way by throwing more money at it and hiring more cops. They can't. So I think that created a really interesting dynamic. And when you meet artists in Philly, they're all in one way or another dealing with social practice, all of them. And first of all, they can afford to, right? It'd be tough to deal with social practice in Boston. And you also wouldn't have that fertile environment to address these issues because, I mean, I'm not saying that poverty doesn't exist in Boston, but it is nothing compared to Philadelphia. I grew up in Tijuana and San Diego, which is probably the most dramatic border crossing in the world. Philadelphia is like having Tijuana on top of San Diego. And that dynamic, that immediacy of high and low, of poverty and you know, was fascinating. So it allowed it to do, you know, allowed it to create some really interesting projects. And also, again, they are forced to collaborate because of the lack of resources. So we did a project, I don't know, there must have been 15, 20 different organizations involved in that show because of, again, the lack of resources.
Could you talk a little bit about how you select art for a specific context, a location, the trustees' properties? You know, is it, how would I say this, is it more universally about the art, or is it about the meaning, history, configuration, some aspect of the specific site that you're selecting for? You could use the two you've done, I guess, and the third that's coming.
So in my case, it was really driven by the site. I mean, you know, we're always looking at artists and thinking about how they think, and it was site and opportunity. You know, when you approach an artist who's very busy, you know, with 6 galleries, you know, 20 art fairs a year, plus museum shows, a biennale, I mean, these guys get busy. These artists get busy. So you need to propose something that is exciting, an opportunity. So that's how I like to sell them. But the only way to create that opportunity is to have a sense of their practice and what they're interested in achieving. So the context of the site provides that opportunity. I hope that makes sense. So in the case of World's End, it was that isolation, that beauty, and the water. Jeppe had wanted to do something near the water for a long time. He doesn't get to do that very often, so that was a plus for him. The idea of reaching a public outside the art world was very important to him, too. When I told him about the 1.6 million visitors, he was like, "Oh, that's awesome." And with Sam, it was history. I mean, you know, other than a couple of artists that have done stuff in Versailles, I mean, you don't really get sites of this magnitude, historical magnitude and importance. And so it was a very, it was really the site for me that dictated who the artist should be.
Yeah, I mean, my practice is not dissimilar in that there's a sort of a principle that I try to observe with a lot of the artists that I bring in to make something new, which is that the artist has to be engaged with questioning something about their own practice that kind of connects to things that we as an institution are also questioning, because that way you get a kind of like a really nice triangulation, and you get work that is meaningful to the artist, and you create experiences for your visitors, your audience, your public that is resonant with the urgency of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're working with an artist who's excited, you can feel it. And if you can feel it, the public can feel it. And I think that I mean, we've all been in situations where the artist isn't that engaged. It's no fun. And when the artist is excited about whatever it is, and that guides us. The process. That's part of the process.
It's contagious.
Also, creating that excitement. I mean, let me tell you that the former Hancock Tower is like pornography for JR. I mean, you sent him that. He was definitely excited because that's the kind of site that artists dream about. Dewey Square was pornography for Os Gemios too. So,
Jared, back here.
I've been watching an art experiment in Massachusetts for about 20 years. A couple named Al Neidl and Karen Boutet have opened galleries. Pittsfield, Greenfield, Cambridge, recently Lowell. They go into a community, they find an old building.
Just hold the mic closer to your mouth.
They talk to realtors, they find an old building, and they start art. They welcome all comers. You don't have to be an art student, you don't have to have any degree. And then they let people do art. They do it as a cooperative. It always fails after a few years. They end up putting their own money in, and they have to move on. As art funding in schools seems to be lessening, I would like to challenge the people of wealth to go to small communities, open buildings, and get some artists in there that welcome the community. And just let the community come in and do art shows. That's a suggestion. Because if you want to keep art, kids interested.
Great, thank you for the question.
And you know what you're saying is actually relatively well aligned with the situation in Philadelphia. I mean, there's cheap real estate. I mean, artists form cooperatives like what's Pace 1020 and Vox Populi, and they get together and they do things. They make things happen. But it's economically feasible. It's sustainable because the cost of living is low. It would be very difficult to do that in this city because our cost of living is so high, and that's just math. I mean, it would be great to have more funding for these things, but then you still are faced with that, really tough nut to crack, which is, you need a lot of money.
All right, we have time for just, I think, one more. Thank you, sir. We have time for just one more question here.
We have these beautiful new art projects coming out into these beautiful landscapes. But I'm curious if you're sensing a shift in what public art is with online. You talk about discovering the Strand Beast through YouTube with new tools like Snapchat. And is there a shift in how people are engaging with what would be classified as public art in an online realm, and how do we keep them grounded to our physical spaces?
I find that the internet, particularly Instagram, because I'm not on Facebook, really has been a fantastic tool. Actually, the minute I try and follow all the artists I'm working with or whose work I'm interested in, it helps figuring out where they are and why they're not returning phone calls, because and also it helps me gauge what they're doing. So it really helps, and I find that more artists are using social media. I have to say though that the first in my experience were the street artists, and this is something that they got into immediately. I was driving with Shepard Fairey one day, and I told him, I said, "Dude, this is awesome, man. You're like, you've blown JR out of the water. You've got more followers than JR on Instagram." And his response was, "Yeah, that's true, but he beats me on Facebook." So he knew it, right? And that shows how important this is to them, and how they use it as a tool to maintain that relationship, that unmediated relationship with the public, which is the kind of thing that puts stress on us because we're the mediators, right? We're the ones that have been mediating traditionally. The institutions are the ones that have been mediating traditionally, and the curators and the professionals. And now these guys are going out there and doing it directly. So for me, it's less about art that's actually really just being made for the internet and online. It's more about how that functions as a tool to communicate and to stay informed, and I have to say it's invaluable.
All right, well, Trevor Smith, Pedro Alonzo, thank you so much for participating in this conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.